The filthiest and most depraved things Vikings did that TV never showed beneath the sanitized veneer of Hollywood epics and romanticized television dramas that portray Vikings as noble warriors sailing toward glorious destinies. There existed a reality so vile and repugnant that modern entertainment deliberately erases it from popular consciousness. Behind the carefully crafted images of heroic raiders and proud shield maidens lay practices so fundamentally depraved that they reveal the true depths of human cruelty when civilization's restraints are stripped away and replaced with a culture that celebrated brutality as divine virtue. These were not the clean sword fights and honorable deaths depicted in modern media, but systematic campaigns of degradation so filthy and obscene that they would shock audiences accustomed to the sanitized violence of contemporary entertainment, revealing a warrior culture that descended into depths of depravity that even medieval chroniclers struggled to describe without resorting to euphemisms and coded language. This is the investigation into the most repugnant and deliberately concealed aspects of Viking culture, practices so fundamentally degrading and obscene that they have been systematically edited out of popular narratives to preserve romanticized images of Norse civilization. Through examination of archaeological evidence that reveals the physical reality of Viking daily life, contemporary accounts from chroniclers who witnessed these practices firsthand, analysis of legal codes that regulated the most depraved behaviors, medical evidence preserved in skeletal remains, and the testimony hidden within literary sources that required sophisticated decoding to reveal their true content, we uncover the horrifying truth about a culture whose celebration of violence extended into realms of human degradation that modern sensibilities can barely comprehend. Today, we explore the systematic practices of ritualized humiliation and degradation that characterized Viking culture, examining the deliberate cultivation of cruelty as both entertainment and religious observance, the sanitary and hygienic realities of Viking settlements that contradicted every romanticized notion of noble warrior culture, the sexual practices and gender violence that formed integral parts of Norse social organization, and the psychological mechanisms that allowed entire communities to participate in levels of systematic brutality that reveal the darkest potentials of human civilization when moral restraints are systematically removed. Drawing upon evidence from excavated settlements across Scandinavia, contemporary accounts from Arab, Byzantine, and European observers, analysis of waste disposal systems and living conditions in Viking communities, and the scattered references preserved in legal and literary sources to practices too depraved for explicit description, we reconstruct a comprehensive picture of Viking culture that explains why modern media consistently avoids depicting the true reality of Norse civilization. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements reveals living conditions so fundamentally unsanitary and degrading that they contradict every romanticized image of noble Norse culture, with excavations showing waste disposal practices that created environments of constant filth and disease that would have made daily life a perpetual ordeal of exposure to human excrement, rotting food, and decomposing organic matter that permeated every aspect of domestic existence. Excavations at major Viking settlements like Hedeby and Jorvik reveal waste management systems that consisted primarily of dumping human and animal waste directly into living areas, creating archaeological layers that document centuries of accumulated filth that would have made these supposedly glorious warrior communities among the most repugnantly unhygienic places in medieval Europe. The hygienic realities of Viking longships during extended raids and exploration voyages created conditions of such extreme filth and degradation that they would have tested the limits of human endurance. With contemporary accounts describing vessels where dozens of men lived in confined spaces without adequate sanitation for weeks or months, creating environments where human waste, vomit, and bodily fluids accumulated in ship holds that became floating cesspools of disease and contamination. Archaeological analysis of Viking ship remains shows evidence of waste disposal practices that involve simply dumping human excrement overboard or allowing it to accumulate in designated areas of vessels, creating living conditions that would have made these celebrated voyages of exploration exercises in surviving the most degrading possible circumstances while maintaining the cohesion necessary for military effectiveness. The sexual practices documented in Norse legal codes and saga literature reveal systematic patterns of sexual violence and degradation that went far beyond simple assault to encompass elaborate forms of ritualized sexual humiliation that were integrated into Viking social and religious customs as both entertainment and demonstration of power relationships within Norse communities. Legal texts from Iceland and Norway contain detailed provisions governing various forms of sexual violence that were considered acceptable within Viking society, including practices so fundamentally depraved that medieval chroniclers could only refer to them through euphemistic language that required sophisticated interpretation to understand their true nature. The treatment of prisoners and captives encompassed forms of systematic torture and degradation that combined physical abuse with psychological humiliation, designed to break human dignity through the most repugnant possible means, including practices involving forced consumption of human waste, ritualized sexual violation in public settings, and forms of mutilation that were designed to maximize both physical suffering and social humiliation for victims who were kept alive specifically to serve as ongoing entertainment for their captors. Contemporary accounts from Christian chroniclers describe witnessing forms of prisoner abuse that were so fundamentally revolting that even hardened medieval observers struggled to find language adequate to describe what they had seen without violating religious prohibitions against describing certain forms of human depravity. The religious practices of Norse paganism included ritual elements that involved the systematic consumption of human bodily fluids, participation in ceremonies that required the handling and ingestion of human remains, and forms of religious observance that combined spiritual devotion with activities so fundamentally disgusting that they would have tested the limits of human revulsion while serving as demonstrations of absolute commitment to pagan religious traditions. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites shows clear signs of ceremonial activities that involved the systematic collection and consumption of various human bodily substances as part of religious ceremonies designed to achieve spiritual communion with Norse deities through the most repugnant possible means. The daily social customs of Viking communities included forms of entertainment and social bonding that revolved around activities involving human waste, bodily functions, and forms of physical degradation that served both as amusement and as mechanisms for reinforcing social hierarchies through the systematic humiliation of lower-status community members. Contemporary legal codes reveal regulations governing various forms of social interaction that involved the deliberate humiliation of individuals through exposure to human waste and other forms of physical degradation that were considered acceptable forms of social entertainment within Norse cultural traditions. The medical and healthcare practices of Viking society involved treatments and procedures that combined genuine therapeutic knowledge with practices so fundamentally unsanitary and degrading that they would have created additional health problems while supposedly addressing medical conditions, including surgical procedures performed without adequate sanitation, treatments involving the application of human waste to wounds, and medical practices that required patients to consume various bodily substances as therapeutic interventions. Archaeological analysis of medical implements and treatment sites shows evidence of healthcare practices that would have exposed patients to systematic contamination and infection through procedures that reflected both genuine medical knowledge and complete disregard for basic sanitary principles. The food preparation and consumption practices within Viking settlements involved cooking and eating habits that combined nutritional necessity with practices so fundamentally revolting that they reveal the extreme conditions under which Norse communities maintained their survival, including the consumption of partially decomposed meat, the incorporation of human waste into food preparation processes during times of extreme hardship, and dining customs that involved the sharing of food that had been contaminated through various forms of deliberate or accidental exposure to human bodily waste. Excavations of Viking-age kitchen areas and food storage facilities show clear evidence of food handling practices that would have resulted in constant exposure to contamination and disease through the consumption of food that had been prepared and stored under conditions of extreme unsanitary neglect. The child-rearing practices within Viking society included forms of physical and psychological abuse that were considered normal aspects of childhood education, with children routinely exposed to levels of violence, sexual content, and degrading treatment that were designed to prepare them for adult participation in a warrior culture that celebrated brutality and degradation as essential aspects of social competence. Legal codes contain provisions governing the treatment of children that reveal systematic patterns of abuse and neglect that were considered acceptable within Norse cultural traditions, including practices involving the deliberate exposure of children to traumatic experiences as educational preparation for adult life in Viking society. The treatment of elderly and disabled individuals within Viking communities involved systematic patterns of neglect and abuse that reflected cultural values that placed no value on individuals who could not contribute to military or economic activities, with archaeological evidence suggesting that elderly and disabled community members were routinely subjected to forms of physical and social degradation that would have made their final years' exercises in surviving systematic humiliation and neglect. Burial evidence from Viking-age cemeteries shows clear disparities in the treatment of elderly and disabled individuals that suggest they were considered expendable members of communities that prioritized military effectiveness over basic human compassion. The economic practices of Viking society included forms of trade and commerce that involved the systematic exploitation and degradation of human beings through practices that went far beyond simple slavery to encompass forms of human commodification that treated people as disposable resources to be consumed and discarded according to economic calculations that placed no value on human dignity or survival. Contemporary accounts from Arab and Byzantine traders describe Viking commercial practices that involved forms of human exploitation so fundamentally depraved that they shocked observers from societies that were themselves familiar with various forms of systematic human abuse and exploitation. The seasonal rhythms of Viking society created periods when normal social restraints were systematically abandoned in favor of extended celebrations that involved community-wide participation in activities so degrading and violent that they would have transformed entire settlements into theaters for the most repugnant possible forms of human behavior, with festivals and religious observances providing occasions for the systematic abandonment of basic human decency in favor of collective participation in activities that celebrated brutality and degradation as expressions of cultural identity and religious devotion. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia during the later Viking Age created conflicts between traditional Norse cultural practices and emerging Christian moral standards that forced Viking communities to abandon or modify their most repugnant traditional practices while developing new forms of cultural expression that maintained their warrior identity within Christian religious frameworks that theoretically prohibited the most extreme forms of systematic human degradation and abuse. The documentation of these practices in medieval literature required sophisticated forms of coded language and symbolic representation that could preserve historical truth about Viking cultural practices while avoiding explicit descriptions of activities so fundamentally revolting that they would have violated contemporary standards of acceptable discourse, leading to complex literary traditions that embedded accurate historical information within narratives that required careful interpretation to reveal their true content about the most depraved aspects of Norse civilization. The international reputation of Viking culture for extreme brutality and degradation influenced diplomatic relations and military strategies throughout medieval Europe, with foreign observers developing detailed accounts of Norse practices that emphasized their systematic cultivation of cruelty and degradation as both military tactics and cultural expressions that distinguished Viking society from other medieval civilizations through their deliberate embrace of practices that other cultures considered fundamentally inhuman and morally unacceptable. As we examine these most repugnant aspects of Viking culture that modern entertainment systematically conceals from popular consciousness, we confront uncomfortable truths about how warrior cultures can develop social systems that celebrate systematic brutality and degradation as expressions of cultural identity and religious devotion, revealing the human capacity for creating civilizations that normalize levels of cruelty and filth that challenge basic assumptions about the relationship between cultural achievement and moral development. The story of these deliberately concealed aspects of Viking culture reminds us that popular historical narratives consistently sanitize the past to create entertaining and inspiring stories that bear little resemblance to historical reality, and that understanding the true nature of past civilizations requires us to acknowledge their capacity for systematic brutality and degradation that reveals the darkest potentials of human social organization when moral restraints are systematically removed in favor of cultural values that celebrate cruelty as virtue and degradation as strength.